please welcome to the Sheena Metal Experience the wonderful Joe Vogel. Joe, it's so great to have you here. You're probably one of the only guests I've ever had on the show for the first time after I spent an entire show talking about your work.
Well, thanks for having me, Sheena. It's good to be here.
It's so great to have you here. When Joe, did you first become fascinated with the topic of Michael Jackson, and how?
I grew up on Michael Jackson, grew up in the 80s, and his music was, all over the radio, and it was, at the height of Michael Jackson mania. And so that's when I was first introduced to it. And, the thing about his music is that as it kind of evolved, or as I grew up, I could learn to appreciate it in new ways. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think in a lot of ways I even like his stuff more now. And I grew up, in junior high and high school with Thriller and Bad. And I've always thought he was brilliant, even from the Jacksons' days. And Off the Wall, I think, is an amazing album. But I think the more that you kind of look back on him now, it's just really amazing, just the quality of artist that he was and the innovator that he was, and how you can, and I talked about this a lot when Scott and I were discussing your book on the show, a lot of how you can feel his influence in so many pop artists and R&B artists and dance artists of today, and rock artists.
Yeah, I mean, his influence is everywhere, and I completely agree. There's this kind of common media narrative, which is that his work, the quality of his work, dropped off after Off the Wall and Thriller, and his work that he did in the 80s. But I make the case in the book that he evolved a lot like the Beatles did. He took on more challenging themes. He addressed issues dealing with the environment, with media, with racism. And a lot of critics haven't really paid attention to that.
No, I agree, and I think that was something that maybe he was so ahead of his time that we didn't really even realize the impact of it until now. I mean, we were all kind of 35 years behind him.
Yeah, that's true. And the other thing that happened is, in the mid '80s, by the tabloids, where the focus shifted from his music to this kind of caricature of his persona, and so rather than pay attention to the important messages and the interesting kind of innovative things that he was doing, it's just this endless. When you actually even read music reviews, they'll spend 3/4 of the review of his albums talking about controversies or tabloid types of subjects. So it's unfortunate because he was an incredible artist, and in a lot of ways he was ahead of his time. In the piece that I released today on the Huffington Post, I talk about Earth Song, which that came out before An Inconvenient Truth or Wall-E or Avatar. A lot of these really influential works that deal with the environment. Michael was doing that 10 or 15 years earlier.
Now, before we talk any more about Michael, let's go back and talk just a little bit about you, Joe.
Okay.
What's kind of your background, and then were you an author first, or did you what have you done before this, and then how did that lead you to this book and to the subsequent articles leading up to the release of this book in the fall?
My background's more in academics. I'm here at the University of Rochester in Western New York, and so the work that I've done a lot of music reviews, but it's freelance work that I kind of do to the side of teaching and my academic work. So that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from.
And then is this your first full-length book?
No, I published a few books before. I did a book on Barack Obama and a book called Free Speech 101, which dealt with a controversy with dealing with filmmaker Michael Moore when he visited a conservative campus, kind of created an uproar. So I've written a few books before that, but this will be the biggest one I've done.
And this is the first one that you've done that's really kind of in the entertainment genre. I mean, I think people I know Michael Moore from films, but I consider him really more of an advocate and an activist and a humanist than I do really in the entertainment world. Have you been thinking for a while about doing a book about Michael Jackson?
Yeah, this book actually started in 2005. So it's been a long evolution, and in the beginning, it was the thing that inspired it was during his trial in 2005, and I was really disappointed with the way the focus had completely shifted from his creative work, his artistic genius. It had completely shifted to the scandals and to the controversies. And I had looked, I'd researched the case enough to know that it was bogus, and it was one of those things where I just thought, here's one of the greatest musicians of our time, and we're talking about everything except for his artistry, and so that was kind of the impetus for writing the book.
Wow. And then how much time, I mean, obviously if you started in 2005, we're talking about years and years of compiling research. Was it hard because he was somebody who, many of the things that he did, he kept very private, not just in his personal life, but his recording sessions were a little private too. I mean, he wasn't exactly somebody who brought the camera in and let's film everything I'm doing and let's make a documentary about me in the studio, especially back in the days of Thriller and Bad, when I think he was a little more insecure. Was it hard to find out information? Because I remember when Scott showed me an early copy of your book, that I believe he was reading that Matt Forger, who's quoted in your book, probably had read before him, who's been on the show as well. He was talking about how it's probably the most comprehensive book about Michael Jackson's work, and all kinds of tidbits about the recordings and the songs and how they came to be, and it's almost like an encyclopedia of Michael Jackson's work.
Yeah, it took a lot of time and a lot of patience to try to figure out who to talk to, who was there, and I was trying to get beyond the obvious people like Quincy Jones, and actually talk to recording engineers, technical engineers, musicians, and really get a sense for how these albums came into being, how these songs were made. And, it was fascinating. And, one door kind of opened the next, and it was just a process of, gradually, reaching out to more people and figuring out, kind of working out a timeline and talking about individual songs, and all the people that worked, including Matt Forger and lots of other people, were very generous. And once they saw that somebody was actually writing a book that wasn't focused on plastic surgery or Bubbles the chimp or somebody
right, exactly, the Elephant Man's bones
on his art, they opened up, and I appreciated it.
Well, and I know, having known Matt for years, and for those of you who have not heard me talk about Matt Forger on the show before, he was the engineer for Thriller and for many of Michael's most successful albums. And, I know that sometimes, I remember, because I was on the air the day that Michael died, and I remember John Scott G is one of my best friends, and I remember us kind of touching base. I was in between doing my music show and doing this show, and I had a break at the time in between. And, Matt was being hounded by people, and it was all kind of the scandal and the paparazzi. And I think that was a regular occurrence for him. And you're right. Nobody ever, almost like in some ways the music got outshadowed by the idiosyncratic behavior and, how many Ferris wheels does he have and Bubbles the chimp, like you said. And I think because of that, and that all of these wonderful professional people that were in his life, Joe, were probably thrilled that you actually wanted to talk about the art and not about, gossip or, and I find that even when I do this show that I think people come in not quite sure what to think of it. And because I don't ever address scandal, I figure, hey, if there's something from your personal life you want to bring up, you'll bring it up. But I'm sure as hell not going to ask. That people feel like, well, open up and tell you anything because they're so thrilled that you're not trying to pull some kind of creepiness out.
With a lot of the people that I talked to, they were a bit unsure in the beginning because they hadn't really experienced just talking to a journalist that would be fair to Michael, and not even like just falling over his work and only reporting like one side of it, but just being fair and just reporting the facts. And so that's what I tried to do, and I think it turned out pretty well.
Now, did you have an idea, Joe, when you started the book, started doing the research for the book, did you have an idea where you wanted it to go, or was it sort of something that evolved as you got more and more into it? Because as you gathered more information, you realized more where kind of the organic path of the book was.
Yeah, it definitely evolved, because in the beginning what I was planning to do was just provide interpretations of the song, which is kind of what I do in my field with literary criticism. So I was just going to, take each album, and go song by song and provide interpretation. And it evolved from there because, first of all, Michael's songs, you can't just think about the lyrics. You have to think about, the music. You have to think about the production. You have to think about the music videos. So there are these kind of really multimedia, multi-genre things that you have to consider a lot of elements. And then the other part of it is that I hadn't thought about was that I wanted to provide more context. I wanted to give people a sense of, the time and history in which these albums were created, how they related to, the kind of cultural events that were happening, and how they were made. And that's so it was actually later in the process that I began reaching out to people that had worked on the albums.
Well, and that's kind of like what every fan really wants to know. And I'm sure fans, want to see pictures and want to know, how many Ferris wheels. But I also think that people that are really diehard music fans of somebody, they are never-ending fascination with the little tiny details of how the songs came together, how the songs changed. They're always looking for uncut versions of things or demo versions of things so they can hear how the song evolved. They want to hear live versions. They want to hear acoustic versions. I mean, they're
Right.
fascinated with the makeup of the music and the stories behind it. And that's what your book has so much of, and what you've obviously researched so much on Michael Jackson in that way. And I think that that's something, like I said, that hasn't really been done to that extent, where he's really been dissected as a creative artist. God knows the public has dissected him enough as a person, but not
Right.
really as a creative artist. I don't know what people just thought he walked into a studio and magic happened, but it's very interesting to hear about kind of his journey as an artist. And also, one of the things that I think is fascinating that I learned from your writings is that he really was a brilliant marketer, and he really was an amazing businessman, and he knew what to put into an album to make people love it. He wasn't just kind of this strange savant that wandered around and he had a couple of songs and it was magic that it just happened to be fantastic. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was in his own right an amazing music producer.
Yeah, he worked really hard on his albums, and some of these songs, dragged out for years and years, like the piece that I did on Earth Song today. That song took 7 years.
Wow.
It was a 7-year process. He started it. He was in a hotel room in Vienna, and that's when the first idea came. And his practice was he carried a tape recorder, and so he kind of put down the melody and put down some basic kind of ideas on tape. He'd record that, and then when he came back, because he was on tour at the time. So when he came back in 1989 into the studio, he began working on it. He reached out to producers and musicians, and it was this really elaborate process where he'd take it from this kind of seed, this idea, and he'd just layer by layer by layer. He was very patient, and that song actually worked on with a producer named Bill Bottrell, who also worked with Sheryl Crow and Madonna and some other people. Worked on that song, and that song was supposed to go on his Dangerous album in 1991, but Michael was such a perfectionist that he passed it up, and everyone thought it was going to be one of the centerpieces of the album, and he passed it up because he didn't think it was right yet, so he saved it for his next album, History, which came out in 1995.
Wow. Now, how much musical training did he have as far as his songwriting? I mean, was he mostly a lyricist, and then he had go-to guys that he would call and they would translate it somehow right on piano or guitar, or did he play enough of an instrument that he could actually write music and lyrics himself and kind of pound out a rough version to then give to his session guys, or how did it start with him as a songwriter conceptually?
Well, he didn't read music, but he could convey music. So, he could, go to a guitarist or a keyboardist and describe it. He could mimic instruments perfectly. And so he did compose. I mean, there's no question he composed, but, he wasn't giving them notes, in terms of writing down the notes on a piece of paper. He would, like I said, he'd record it. And then when he had a chance to talk to musicians or producers, he would convey exactly how it was supposed to sound, how the melody was supposed to sound, the tempo, the instruments. He was really a genius at doing that.
So he could actually go to each member of his band, and I think we saw a little bit of this in the last documentary about him, that he could go around to people and sort of pound out the rhythm with his foot while he sang the part to them. And it was definitely a music part he was singing. It wasn't, figure out something, I'm singing the vocal line. He could go sing all the different parts. It was very Mozart-y.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he was very, everyone that I talked to said that he was extremely involved in terms of, from the conception of the song all the way through to the final mix. He was right there, making sure it was exactly how he wanted. And you're right, people did see that, and this is it. And I think it surprised some people because they assumed, with a huge production like that, they assumed, okay, he just puts, Kenny Ortega or some of these other people in charge, and they pretty much create the whole thing, and then he shows up and performs. But you saw in that film, in that documentary, how involved he was in every aspect of the making of that show.
Yeah, and I like that because I think that really showed him. I think that when you're as famous as he is, or was, I think that people is at the time of the movie. People assume that you wander around and a limousine picks you up, and somebody gives you a pedicure, and then everybody else has been working on the music for weeks, that you kind of show up and do your little bit of a dance, and then you kind of wander off and somebody serves you, a Cornish game hen for lunch. I don't think that people, when you're that famous, associate you with really getting down in the nitty-gritty and having to do with the nuts and bolts of putting a show together. You almost become like a figurehead, like the Queen of England. You show up at the end, wave a little bit with your crown on, and then go back to the palace. And I think people had begun to think of him like that, and not as somebody who kind of still had his hands in the dirt. But I think in a lot of ways, with a lot of the charity work that he did, a lot of the environmental work that he did, and definitely when he was putting together albums, he was definitely somebody who rolled up his sleeves and stuck his hands in the dirt.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's one of those funny things because that was the majority of his life, was that behind-the-scenes stuff, that stuff, being immersed in the music, being immersed in his videos, in his performances. That was the majority of his life. He was actually pretty reclusive, and, when everyone was wondering, where is he, what is he doing, that's what he was doing. He was making music, and he was creating, and he was reading, and he was learning. He had this incredible curiosity about art and what made great art, and he was always learning, and he was always trying to figure out what to do in terms of it. He used to watch documentary footage of panthers to try to mimic their movements in his dance. He was just so attentive, and he would implement that kind of stuff into his performances. And so it's just one of the ironies of, people that think that, like you said, that he was, just enamored with celebrity. He actually didn't really like being famous. He liked attention in terms of performing, but most of his life was just this kind of behind-the-scenes creativity.
Do you think that he had any idea, Joe, how talented he was?
Yeah, I do. I think he knew. I think he was very aware of his place in history. I think he was very cognizant of that. And there's tons and tons of documentary footage of all this stuff. And I think part of the reason for that is that he was aware, that he was an artist, and he aspired to be an important artist. He, like I said, he studied the work of the greats, of Beethoven and Michelangelo, or from every field. You know, he studied them, and that's what he aspired to.
That's awesome. But he didn't have an ego. He didn't have the kind of ego I think that he had from having Matt on the show and Matt Voyager and talking to him a little bit about it. He certainly was a perfectionist. I mean, he, like you said, he would take 7 years to get a song right and do many versions and spend a lot of money to make sure it was perfect. So he certainly was a perfectionist. But he didn't have that kind of crazy ego that a lot of famous people get with the, I should be eating at a different table than everybody and don't look me in the eye. I think if anything, the stories that we hear about him in a working environment was that maybe because his childhood was so, segregated and bizarre, that he really kind of wanted to just be one of the guys, and he liked to hang out and work with the dancers, and he liked to work with his engineering team, and it felt good for him to be in an ensemble collaborative process.
Right. Yeah, it's one of these, again, these funny juxtapositions, because you have, on the one hand, he floats statues of himself down the Thames River to promote his album.
But that's to promote the album, though. That's because he had that P.T. Barnum thing.
Exactly. And so critics take that and they say, oh, look at this, he's a megalomaniac, he's, narcissistic. But then, like you said, I talk to the people that work with him, and down to like assistant engineers, they talk about how humble he was, how kind, when they would do something for him, he would, Bruce Swedien, one of his longtime recording engineers, says, he would say, can you turn the volume up a little bit? And then, the volume would turn up, he'd say, thank you, and it's just, he was, and Bruce was talking about how polite he was, because a lot of stars, don't really have that. But he was very humble. He had a great sense of humor, and when he put his mind into these albums, he got right into it and assembled a team around him, and they worked really hard on him.
Well, and I think probably because so much of his life seemed very lonely. He spent a lot of time kind of sequestered off. The poor guy, if he wanted to go to Disneyland, he had to rent it for the night because he couldn't go do anything normal because he would get mobbed by people. So that alone, I remember my mom always telling me that she read an interview with Elvis once, and they asked him what his dream was, and it was to go to like Bob's Big Boy with his friends and have a hamburger because he could never have that experience. And I think that Michael Jackson had that same kind of uber superstardom where he didn't get the opportunity to just, hey, I'm going to go see a movie in a theater with the public and just hang out and enjoy it. So maybe perhaps these ensemble situations in work were really the most important time that he had to actually bond with people and to be in a situation where he could just be another one of the guys. I mean, even though everybody knew he was calling the shots, but, still he could be dancing with all the dancers and feel like he was a part of a group of something. Because I think that people that don't know much about fame don't realize that the more famous you get, it's just natural, the course of it, that you become more and more isolated.
Right. Yeah, and Michael, obviously, by necessity, had to become extremely isolated. But yeah, behind the scenes, when he was working at the end of Earth Song, I have a story in the piece that I published today about him sitting down with one of the assistant engineers, and his name's Rob Hoffman, and he's talking about how John Lennon, right before he sang "Twist and Shout," his voice gave out, and that was the reason why his voice was really just gritty, kind of scratchy vocal. And Michael loved the story, and right after that, he did the final ad-libs on Earth Song. Those just incredible at the climax of Earth Song when he's doing the call and response with the Andre Crouch Choir. And these stories to me were just fascinating to learn because you realize, like you said, he's a normal person that's curious, that loves what he's doing, passionate about what he's doing, and creating incredible music.
When did he, do you think, from your research, Joe, when do you think that Michael Jackson consciously became aware of an intent to integrate things that he very much believed in, world issues, into his music? because certainly he was a human rights activist, he was an equality activist, he was an environmental activist, he was a protector of children and an animal activist. So, when did he really consciously, because there's a fine line between, okay, I believe in something, and when I write music, what I believe goes into my music. And actually, like he did with many songs, and certainly with, We Are the World and things like that, where he was consciously participating in things that he knew if he stuck his name behind it, it was going to raise world awareness.
Yeah. Well, I think it started pretty early. I mean, in the late 70s, he was already in interviews, beginning to talk, about these types of things. Obviously, in 1985, he wrote "We Are the World," which raised a ton of money for famine in Ethiopia. And then "Man in the Mirror," of course, in 1987. But I think that it really kind of began to coalesce and just kind of become more directed and more specific towards the end of the 1980s, right after the Bad album. When you listen to the Dangerous album, which came out in 91, he was working on it from about 1989 to 1991, you start to really notice a shift in terms of the themes that he's addressing, a lot more political themes. That's when Black or White came out.
Right.
And, Black or White, was very, right around the time of the Rodney King beating and the riots in Los Angeles. He wrote that song, Gone Too Soon, for Ryan White, who was a victim of AIDS. And so all of the kind of really, pressing social issues at that time, you can start to see that he's implementing them more specifically into his music and, dedicating a lot of time and money into those causes.
Yeah, and I forgot about that. He was definitely I guess that falls under the children banner, but he was definitely a pediatric AIDS activist as well, one of the first people to really expose Ryan White's story and talk about all of the children that were born with AIDS because their mothers contracted it when they were pregnant or from blood transfusions like Ryan White did, and really come out and talk about that when AIDS was still kind of a very controversial, taboo topic that nobody wanted to touch. And he was one of the first. It was
a very misunderstood, at that time, and he was one of the first, celebrities to speak out. He had Ryan White featured in his music video for Gone Too Soon. And it was soon after, actually, Magic Johnson, had just announced that he had HIV, and he put Magic Johnson in his Remember the Time video. And so he wasn't afraid. It was one of those, and, the coda to Black or White is just astonishing. It was one of the boldest moves he'd ever made in a music video, where people are gathering around their TVs. I think that was the most watched music video in history. It was broadcast on 3 or 4 different channels like Fox and MTV and everything, and everyone's expecting this kind of, family friendly, like kumbaya kind of message, and then he delivers that coda, which is just kind of astonishing.
Right. Well, and also the amazing end of that video where you're seeing how everyone's morphing into everyone else and realizing that it's just a couple of frames of difference between old, young, male, female, black, white, Latin, Asian. I mean, he ran the gambit of faces, and you saw how really faces were just faces, and it didn't take much for one face to morph into the next. And I think that he was a very strong equality rights activist and always was, even in the late 70s when people didn't really talk that much about it. He was his themes were very much about, not only in his music but also when he spoke as a person, about you shouldn't see color, you shouldn't see gender, you shouldn't see age, you shouldn't see classism. We're all the same. We're all God's children. The animals are also equal to us. I mean, those were, I don't think we really, because now we're all kind of airy-fairy and loving our age of enlightenment. But in the 80s, we didn't talk about a lot of stuff like that. That was a big taboo, and especially for a celebrity and especially for somebody who had a mainstream audience that they could quote-unquote lose if somebody thought they were too out there, and also for a male celebrity because, you found in the beginning when AIDS activism began and celebrity AIDS awareness, it was a lot of women. It was Elizabeth Taylor and Madonna and Morgan Fairchild. It was not male celebrities coming out and talking about it. And he did. And I think the fact that in a way he was almost kind of, I don't want to say genderless, but had, aspects of male and female spirit in him, made him sort of a neutral voice to talk about things.
Yeah, and I think, that's one of the things that made, people uncomfortable, is that he didn't fit into these traditional boxes that we like people to fit into. And, in terms of race and gender and sexuality and all these things, there was kind of an ambiguity about him that people had a hard time understanding. But Michael was pretty defiant about it. He just pretty much said, this is who I am. This is, take it or leave it. And a lot of people obviously had millions and millions of fans, but I think that, especially beginning in the 80s, you start to notice that people are becoming uncomfortable with certain aspects of him, and I think it's because he started to defy those kind of stereotypes of, what people expected him to be.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy because energetically, sometimes he felt very feminine and sometimes he felt very masculine, and a lot of times he felt kind of in between. And and I think also he perpetuated that, not only in the fact that naturally I think he just encompassed aspects of both, but I also think that because he stayed ambiguous about it, because he wasn't trying to be all macho and punch people on the arm, or he kind of, I mean, in a way, and this is going to sound, probably the most out there thing anybody's ever said to you in an interview, but there was almost something a little not of this earth about him, where he almost just read a little different from human beings, period. And I think for some people, yes, that was off-putting, Joe, but I also think for some people that was a lot of his appeal, that he was so different and very magic and so talented and almost unable to fail at anything. Everything he touched turned to platinum. And any kind of bold chances he would take, whether it be in a video or on an album or, with a charity spot he was doing or something collaborative like We Are the World, it was just like a home run every time.
Yeah, it's interesting when I was talking to people about him that worked with him, they actually described him as otherworldly, and so you'd expect that maybe to hear that description from maybe a fan kind of looking from afar. But the fact that even people that worked closely with him, they talked about this aura that he had. In fact, even the engineer, I'm forgetting his name, for the Beatles, when he was recording with Michael and Paul McCartney, he talked about Michael's aura, this kind of strange kind of quality that he had that was just entrancing. And I think, long before Lady Gaga, Michael was just this kind of walking performance artist. It seemed like he was walking right out of a music video. So, he was always in costume, and, when people saw him in public, it was just, you had to look, because he looked so unique.
Well, but he was also very much a fan of the stars of old Hollywood and old Broadway. And in those days, you didn't walk out of the house unless you were dressed up to be in a movie or you were ready to go on stage, because you never knew who was going to take your picture. And it wasn't like now where, take a picture of Cameron Diaz at the airport in a baseball cap and no makeup. Back then you were a star and no one ever saw you unless you were in star dress. And I think he very much modeled himself after that glamorous period that had gotten a lot less glamorous by the time he had grown up in it. And I think he liked that idea that when you're out, you present. So when he was out, then he was wearing show costumes.
Yeah. No, I agree. He was enamored by old Hollywood, and he said in the mid 1980s, he said, "I want my whole life to be the greatest show on earth."
Yeah.
So everywhere, he didn't want, because if you show what's happening, behind the scenes, if people see you, just, without, then he thought, it loses the magic,
And in a way, he's right. And it's funny because my mom, who is Depression era, who had me when she was later in life. So she's almost, she's going to be 78 in the fall. She complains about that all the time. She says, I don't want to see movie stars in their sweatpants. I don't want to see them on the toilet. I don't want to see them screaming at somebody in the grocery store with, the plastic surgery bandage wrapped around their face. I want to see glamour. And I like the fact that when I was a kid growing up in old Hollywood with all of those going to the movies every weekend, that you didn't know all the scandal and all the gossip. Everybody was larger than life, and they were fabulous. And that's all there was. You didn't think about like who has a hemorrhoid or who got their teeth fixed. You never talked about any of that. It was just they came down from heaven and they were perfect, and then they died and they ascended back. And that was all. Then that was what made movie stars. And I think that maybe he grew up like thinking that being such a showman and thinking that time was just so much more glamorous, than now. And he's just not the kind of guy that you would have seen like, showing up to an event in sweatpants and, a 3-day-old beard. I just don't think, I think that he would have considered that extremely rude and classless.
Yeah. No, really. I think he thought that he would be letting his fans down if he did that. Because he felt, because he'd been performing since he was 5 years old, and so he felt that he was always, anytime he went out into public, he was in performance mode. And that's something that people, don't always consider. There's obviously some difficult aspects of that, to always have to have that pressure that anytime you're in public, you're basically in performance mode. But he enjoyed it in certain ways, in other ways, obviously, he didn't. It was very difficult.
Well, and I think it gave him the freedom to enjoy a private life that nobody ever saw. If he was going to be schlumping around in his sweatpants, then that was just his time at home.
Right.
And that he really could make a distinction between. And honestly, I think that that's one of the reasons he was so big, was that you never saw him like scratch his butt or sitting around with a gut on a beach somewhere. And I think that's especially why he was so huge in Europe and in Asia and South America, where they have so much more respect for glamour and dressing up and presenting and looking perfect when you go out. I think that that's why he was so huge. And because, we're kind of a slobby country compared to the rest of the world.
No, there's definitely, I think, other countries definitely were more tolerant in terms of, they didn't have the same type. Michael was actually much bigger globally in the 90s than he was in the 80s. It was only in the United States that, he was kind of lost some of his appeal in the 90s. And yeah, they were fascinated by him. They were fascinated by the way he looked. They were fascinated by, everything about, him as an artist, the way he presented his music videos. And, he did this thing, he did it very intentionally where, in the age of Twitter and TMZ and stuff like that, it's just this constant bombardment of information about celebrities. But Michael intentionally, kind of left the picture so that when he came back, people were excited about it. There was kind of this build-up, this anticipation. It was very intentional. He didn't want to be overexposed. He never liked to present awards or, appear on tons of different shows, in a row. He wanted to just kind of preserve and save and then come out and make a big splash.
Yeah, and whether we like it or not, the truth is that fans are more crazy about you the less of you they see.
Yeah.
I
think there's some truth to that.
Autographs are more expensive for people that hardly ever give them. They're bigger on the market.
Right.
Celebrities that make special appearances or give out awards, so much bigger of a deal if they almost never do. People that you get used to seeing all the time, you become desensitized because I think, again, it takes away from that magic of, when am I going to see them? And will he appear at the Grammys? And I think that Michael did a lot of that. We're going to take a quick break. Then
Michael, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if Michael performed, if he was going to be at an award show, he was going to be the finale. He was going to be the big, kind of draw, and that's the only way he would do it, and that's just, he knew that's the kind of attention he drew, and that's the only way he wanted to do it.
Awesome. Was one of the hardest things when doing a book, Joe, about Michael Jackson, cutting it down so that it it didn't look like the original Canterbury Tales?
Yeah, no, I definitely had to, towards the end of the process, I probably cut about 100, 150 pages. Because there is so much interesting stuff, but when you're covering his entire solo career, you have to decide, what's important and what you have to leave out.
I mean, you probably had enough cool research to have written a book on each one of the albums.
Yeah, no, I had it all footnoted. Like I said, I come from an academic background, so I had tons and tons of footnotes with these kinds of, just trivial but interesting information, and a lot of that, unfortunately, I had to cut out.
Now, are you excited to see when the book comes out in the fall, what the reaction of fans is going to be? Because I would imagine, one, people are already pre-ordering it because Michael Jackson fans are diehard, and two, that you're going to be maybe teaching them some stuff they didn't even know. They're going to learn things in the book that they didn't even know about Michael, and they probably think they know everything.
Yeah, no, it's exciting because there aren't a lot of books out there about Michael Jackson. When I was researching this, it would have been nice to have more, kind of material to lean on a little bit. But there's just not a lot of stuff that deals with his artistry. And, so fans have been really excited about it and really supportive, and I'm excited for them to see it.
I think that's wonderful. How is the book different from how you thought it was going to be when you were researching? I mean, what things surprised you, even with all that you thought you knew about Michael Jackson?
I think I was surprised because, like you said, there's a magical quality to Michael in terms of his persona, in terms of his performances. But what I found is that magic wasn't lost when I kind of went behind the scenes. It was fascinating. It was fascinating to learn how he operated as an artist. It was fascinating to learn kind of his nuances in terms of his preferences in the studio. He liked to sing in the dark. He liked to drink scalding hot water before he sang. Just learning some of these details and learning what went into these songs was just really interesting to me. And just to see what a perfectionist he was and how patient, in terms of letting a song. He always talked about letting the music reveal itself, letting the music speak to him. And so it was a process that, like I said, sometimes took years, but it was fascinating to learn about.
Now, why did he drink scalding hot water before he sang?
It was to open up his vocal cords, just to kind of give him maximum ability to. And he also, would do warm-up, like 2 hours a lot of times before singing a song.
Wow.
And his vocal coach, Seth Riggs, talked about how rare that is, to have that kind of commitment. He would do scales. He developed a 4-octave range. People often forget because he was this incredible child singer. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And for him to make that transition, from being able to sing as a child to being able to sing, extremely well and with just amazing versatility and range as an adult, that didn't just happen by accident. He worked really hard at it. And before he ever, would record a song, he'd prepare for it.
But now we know, Joe, it was the scalding hot water. You can retain your voice of childhood if the water's hot enough.
That's right.
Do you think that he had a lot of ritualistic things like that, where he was so dedicated to his art and to his perfectionism that he did a lot of sort of artistic boot camp type things that we might consider very severe, but that it's not unnatural for very devoted artists to do?
Yeah, I think he had a lot of those things. He definitely, one of his things with each new album, he always said, I want to come up with sounds that the ear has never heard. And so he was very creative about it, instead of just taking stock sounds. Like, he'd actually have his engineers go out and bang on trash cans, or, he'd just find, like, interesting percussion sounds that you could just find in, he'd have people go out to his zoo at Neverland and record the animals. And he would actually implement this stuff into his music. And that's why, sonically, when you listen to his songs, it's very innovative, it's very interesting, and there's a lot of unique sounds.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. You know what, Joe, I can't wait to read the book. What is the release date for the book?
It's November 1st.
And that's A Man in the Music, The Creative Life and Work of Michael Jackson. And where can people find the Earth Song article now?
An excerpt of it is on Huffington Post right now, and it's also on the whole full version is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
It's wonderful. And where can people find out about you online and everything that you do?
My website is joevogel.net, and so all the information in terms of this piece that I just wrote and my book and anything else is right there. I'm also on Twitter.
And Joe, will you come back and see me again? I would love that.
I would love to, Sheena, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.